Hi folks, we're gonna go take a walk in the woods this evening and look for some mushrooms. We're specifically gonna look for oyster mushrooms on tree snags. But before we do, I thought I'd just share with you some things you might want to bring if you're out looking for mushrooms of interest, whether you plan to eat them or you're just curious what they are. You might like to find yourself a basket. And I like to bring some extra paper bags so I can segregate things, especially if there are things I know are edible and are not edible. You might like to have a notebook. It's really helpful to record the habitat that you're in, whether the mushroom's growing on trees, on the ground, what kind of species are nearby, or if you don't know, then you can write down some important features that you see in the forest. A knife, this is a mushroom knife, but you can bring just any knife with you. You might want to have a compass. I have a hand lens here for looking at close-up features. You don't necessarily need that in the field. It's helpful to have at home if you get really into this. And you might want like a permanent marker to write notes on your bags. So that should do it. Let's go for a walk.
Okay, so I want to do a quick comparison here between an oyster look-alike and an oyster mushroom. So you can see these white mushrooms growing on this down tree that is well decaying, missing nearly all of its bark. There's a little bit of bark here, and it comes from this tree, so it's actually an aspen, which is a tree that an oyster mushroom does grow on. But if I take a sample of this here, you can see that the underside of this mushroom is not white. It's actually sort of brown colored because the spores are starting to come out, and those spores are brown. That tells us this is probably a Crepidotes genus mushroom. So in general, I had said maybe just when you're first starting out, stay away from anything that's growing on conifer, but in addition, I might just say if it's missing all its bark and you can't tell what species of tree it is, maybe that's another one to stay away from it as you're just beginning.
All right. So, we have some oysters. So what I'd like to do is just take a bit of a bigger perspective here at first. Let's take a look around. We are in a very typical northern hardwood forest. It's mostly sugar maples. There's some yellow birch in here. There's some balsam fir in the understory. There's a little bit of basswood. There's some ironwood, mostly hardwood trees, not a whole lot of conifer here. But again, because we're looking for oyster mushrooms, we're looking for these tree snags, so dead trees. And in this region here, there are quite a few. So the oyster mushroom, it's a saprophytic mushroom. So that's one thing that helps us to identify it correctly. And what that means is that it consumes the carbon tissue of dead wood. So it doesn't attack living trees like parasitic mushrooms do. It doesn't live on the forest floor and have relationships with the tree roots like mycorrhizal mushrooms do, but it is actually decomposing and recycling this tree into a future tree. These are pretty well developed here, and there are a lot of little beetles eating it. That's what these black dots are in here. So it's a little past prime probably for most of our consumption, but somebody else is really enjoying it. Oyster mushrooms are in the genus Pleurotus, and it's a species complex, so there's more than one species. It tends to grow, in my experience, in our region here in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan. I tend to find it early in the spring, anytime after morel season, growing on aspen trees and relatives. And then around midsummer. It's late July right now. I tend to see it on harder trees like hard sugar maple, sometimes on red maple, sometimes actually on basswood, which is not a hardwood. Very rarely will an oyster mushroom grow on a conifer, and I suggest if you find that you don't collect it for the table. So what I'd like to do is, so pleurotus actually means pleur, P-L-E-U-R, means on the side. So pleurotus is a mushroom that grows shelf-like on wood in clusters like this. Usually they're horizontally arranged. And otis has something to do with an ear, so it maybe looks like an ear, but the common name oyster mushroom indicates that it's much in the shape of an oyster. Okay, so I'd like to harvest a small oyster mushroom here so we can take a look at some of its features and talk about what's similar to and different from other mushrooms you might confuse an oyster with. So I'm just going to harvest this one. So an oyster mushroom is a gilled mushroom. The gills are decurrent down this stem. The stem is very minimal, and where it occurs, it tends to be lateral or off-center on the side where it attaches to the tree. This one is fairly fresh, so it's mostly white. It can also be tannish, grayish, but they do tend to yellow in age, especially in the gills. This here is a pleasing beetle, and they lay their eggs on oyster mushrooms, and then their larvae consume the fungus. One important feature that separates oysters from another mushroom called Crepidotus, which is the genus name, that Crepidotus will grow on conifer trees, especially old dead conifers, but Crepidotus has a brown spore print. Then there's the angel wings, which is a tiny little white shelf fungi, very bright white, tends to be maybe maximally this large. It grows on conifer, dead conifer trees, principally in my experience. It's very thin, very pliable and white. It wouldn't provide a whole lot of food to eat. So if you find any mushrooms looking like this growing on conifer, I would say just avoid those. And in general with mushrooms, you want to have a positive ID before you really start messing around with eating them. So get your spore print. I did it a few times. Now the nice thing about an oyster mushroom, or all mushrooms that are saprophytic growing on dead trees, is that this will grow on the same tree for a few years until it runs out of material to eat and consume within this tree. So once you feel like you have a positive identification for this, and you don't necessarily need to think about eating it that year, but the following year you could note the season you found it and come back and look again. In fact, this is how we know about this mushroom here, is we found it previous years. And the season in general, like I said, for oyster mushrooms can last between post-morel season, I would say, to maybe late August or so. So I have a couple specimens. I have an older one and I have a younger one. And I'd like to take those home so we can do a spore print. And I'll just put those in a bag here and then talk a little bit about some kind of harvesting etiquette that I would recommend considering. So when you're harvesting things in the wild, it's tempting to, especially fruit and things you can eat, it's tempting to just want to harvest all that you see and take it with you. But I highly recommend considering a different approach, and I really recommend reading a chapter in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and the chapter is called The Honorable Harvest. And in there are lots of really great, respectful approaches to harvesting something, involving asking permission to harvest, asking permission from the landowner, but also asking permission from the tree, from the mushroom, from the forest. And you have to decide what that means. Not taking all of what you find and taking less than half of what you find, maybe even taking a third or less of what you find, so that pleasing beetles and other things that eat them, or some other person maybe who comes along, might also enjoy that. And it just gets to fill out its life cycle and its purpose here. And one other thing I'll mention is that mushrooms are a fruit. So you can think of them as like the apple of a tree. If you harvest the apples, you aren't harming the tree. But the apples do have a function, and they have many functions. And so if you harvest all the apples, you're taking away food from deer, but also if those apples disperses by seed, if you remove all that seed, you're also removing the ability of the tree to reproduce into the future. And just enjoy the fungus. They're wonderful.
Okay, so let's say that you think you might have found some oyster mushrooms in the woods, and you've taken a sample of the mushrooms home with you, and you want to determine if indeed that's what you have. So what you want to do is take a spore print. So here I have a few different mushrooms, all of which I believe are oyster mushrooms. And the thing to do with any mushroom when you're collecting, if you're for identification purposes, is to collect just a few mushrooms, but in different phases of maturity or stages of maturity. So smaller and larger. As the mushrooms get larger, they start to release their spores, and of course they may be not so great to eat anymore. And so sometimes it's the smaller mushrooms that you're going to get a better spore print from, but you could try both. What I like to do is I like to put the mushrooms on a piece of paper that has a contrast in colors. If you have black and white, that can be good. A lot of mushrooms have white spore prints, but many of them have dark, so it's sometimes nice to see what the color looks like against different colors. And so what I would do is I would probably put a couple of different sizes of mushrooms across the colors. Here with the spore surface facing the paper. And then I have a lot of these kind of salad-y containers at home, so it's nice to cover that, because if there's any sort of movement of air, the spores can travel, so it makes a nicer spore print if you can restrict the movement of air. And it also just contains the mushroom nicely too. When you're done with it, it's easy to get rid of. So then I have the lid of that underneath, and I just cover that loosely, and you can leave that for a few hours to a day or so until you have a spore print. So another note on collecting mushrooms that you intend for the table is let curiosity be your friend first. Don't get too impatient and interested in eating mushrooms before you really know them. Become a student of what you see and really practice your observation skills. This is really fun. So I really like to, when I have a mushroom that I don't know, I also take notes. I might take my notes here, just spend some time with the mushroom looking at it. What do you see? What is the cap color? Is it smooth or hairy? What is the margin like? Is it entire or wavy or toothy? Are there gills or teeth or pores? What color are they? How does the stem attach? How large is it? What color is it? Is it hairy? Does it have anything on it? Does the mushroom have a smell? There are other things too, but these are all really great observations that can help you in identifying what you find. And you still may not be able to identify the mushrooms you find, and that's okay. You're learning still.
So I have already prepared a spore print of this mushroom, and let's just examine that here. So I'll lift these 2 mushrooms, and they've been here a couple days, so they're starting to get old. This one really just shows a stain, but here you can see the spore print against that darker background is actually light. It's almost peachish colored. So oyster spore prints tend to be white or creamy or lilac tinged, but never brown or rusty. So I would definitely say that is not brown or rusty. So we're in good shape here. So if you've collected oyster mushrooms and you know you have oyster mushrooms, if you can't use them right away, I recommend storing them in your refrigerator in a double paper bag, not plastic. They will last much longer that way. They just need to breathe. Otherwise, mushrooms, like our skin, have the ability to turn sunlight into vitamin D. One way to maximize that is to dry the mushrooms outdoors, or even to expose them to a little bit more sunlight. If you have wild mushrooms, they probably have a little bit of vitamin D already, but you can expose them to direct light. So I would recommend just a couple of hours outside. This is a drying rack, but if you don't have one, you can use something else like a basket or a screen. If the mushrooms are dirty, you could take a little brush and wipe them a little bit before that. Gill side up in this case. That's the surface we're primarily interested in here. These mushrooms are a little bit starting to get old. They've been in the fridge for a few days here. So anyway, so you want to put them on your tray or whatever you're using. Put that outside for an hour or 2 or more if you have it. If you want to use them fresh though, you don't want to dry them out too much. Finally, I'll just give you a glimpse into one way in which you can play around with expanding oyster mushrooms from the stem butts that you collected. So oyster mushrooms are, as we talked about already, they're saprophytic, so they eat dead wood, and cardboard comes from wood. So I'm going to use this Millie's pizza box here for our substrate. So I've taken part of that box and I've soaked it in water overnight so it's nice and squishy and wet. And we're going to make some oyster burritos. So first thing we want to do is kind of wring that out a little bit here. Now with many mushrooms, when you're trying to expand them or cultivate them, you need a sterile environment. So that would not be with my bare hands here. I'd probably be in a sterile room or under a fume hood or using some kind of pressure cooker. But with oysters, they're a little bit more forgiving. Oysters are fairly aggressive mushrooms, so you can mess around with this a little bit. It's a fun activity with kids too. So I'm going to take one piece here. I'll set aside the other piece. So it's kind of wrung out. It's very wet, but it's not like super dripping wet. And I'm going to the layers separate pretty darn easily. Now I'm going to take my oyster stem butts and put those on top and kind of disperse them around here a little bit. Small chunks are better than large. And then I'm just simply going to roll that up like a burrito. And then we'll take the burrito wrapped up and we'll put that in a Ziploc bag. It can be a used bag that you've washed. And close it up. You know, you don't want it to be airtight. The idea, it needs just a little bit of oxygen, but not very much. So mostly closed up or closed up all the way and occasionally let it breathe for just a little bit. Okay, then you can label it. So I'm gonna say wild oyster on maple and the date. And then you want this to be in a relatively dark environment, in a place where you're not gonna forget it. So I'm gonna put this in a paper bag. And I'll just loosely close that. I might set myself a reminder to check this like once a week. Depending on the temperature, it might grow faster or slower. If it really dries out, you might add a little moisture, but you can really just play around with that. And then you can expand from there if it works. That would be the source of a whole new video on how to do that. So I'll let you look that up on the internet. It's pretty readily available on how to do that. Here's what it might look like after the mycelium from those stem bites grows into that cardboard. And this one here is absolutely ready to expand either into another cardboard or into coffee grounds or some other substrate. And eventually you can fruit that into mushrooms. Thanks folks, enjoy your mushrooms. I hope you fall in love with them. Take care.